Data Storytellers. This one has been a long time coming. Had some cool conversations with Dejan, and I hope I pronounced the name correctly. And welcome to the show.
Thanks, Laszlo. It's a pleasure and an honor being here. Thanks.
Oh, fantastic. So, look, you work for FanDuel. I would like to understand a few things about your current mission, what you're doing at the moment. But before we get there, and this is a question I haven't asked you before, how did you get into the world of data analytics?
Unlike other people that probably grew into it, that were trained into it, went to college, I fell into it. And that easily put, I cut my teeth in analytics when I was at Microsoft. So one of my first career jobs was at Microsoft. And when I got there, I didn't do analytics. But I mean, everyone kind of does a little bit of analytics for their job, right? You're analyzing data, you're seeing some trends, you're trying to get some insights. And but I went into an analyst role as my second role at Microsoft. And that is where and the role was an analyst for their consumer-facing products, right? But thinking about consumer behavior, thinking about how people got to the products, how people use the products, and how you could influence people using your products. What are those things and those intersections you could do? Fell in love with analytics then, kind of fell into it, but also fell in love with the customer. So that's like the kickstarting of my career in analytics, and it's kind of matured since then.
Just a quick follow-up question on that. Well, what do you mean by falling in love with the customer? I already have my ideas, but this really just caught my imagination.
I think it's the different areas of business that anyone can be in. You always have a passion, right? Like, why do you do a certain job? Like, you can be in accounting because you just love numbers, right? You like the black and white. You love compliance, right? There's certain things that you love. For me, I fell in love with behavior. And for me, behavior dictates so many things on which we should be doing, especially from an analytics side. People try to put customers in certain groupings and certain categories. And for me, it's not about, it is about categorizing your customers, but the method and how you categorize your customers, right? For me, it's not about a demographic. An 18-year-old could behave the same way as an 80-year-old, right? Maybe they consume the same things online. Maybe they play the same games online. Maybe they buy the same sneakers. You don't know, right? So for me, it's about a behavior dictation versus a premeditated segmentation that you kind of put on people. So for me, it was very fascinating when I was cutting data as an analyst to understand, what did that behavior show us? And you cross-reference it with some of these, what I would call more traditional categories of users. And it wouldn't always meet what intuitively you would think. Again, like, go back to that simple example: an 18-year-old and an 80-year-old have the same behaviors online. Well, potentially, right? So if you're a marketer, what do? Right? You market to them very similarly, even though traditionally you would probably think differently, right? So for me, I fell in love with understanding users, understanding behavior, and that's kind of carried through my entire career. I want to understand how people behave. I want to understand things that people are doing, and then those are the solution. Like, that's where you analyze. That's where you bring up different solutions.
I love that, because there's something magical about behavior. Because I always like to say that behavior tells the truth. People can say things. People can believe that they think something or think that they believe something, but behavior will reveal the truth. Right. And it's so cool that you can use data to capture that truth.
Absolutely. In a previous role, I think we saw it all the time. People would take certain surveys and say, okay, here's what I am like, or here's what at least I want you to think I'm like. Here's the perception I want to leave with you. But the reality is, your behavior might dictate something completely different, right? And I think, and it's not malicious by the person, right? And maybe they have a certain way to think about or how they want to be perceived. Here, I'll just give a simple example. I can say that I'm green. I'm a green person because I have a trash can and a recycling bin. But the reality is, if my household has 3 SUVs and the carbon footprint of my house is very big, and I'm consuming a lot of natural resources, am I really green? but I want you to think I am, and I want to think that I am myself, right? And that's just like a simple example that I like to use about perception versus reality.
Oh yeah, I really like that, because basically these behaviors are driven by beliefs. So that's the actual inner wiring of the person. And then what you articulate, that's more like in your conscious mind. And this is so cool. And maybe later we'll talk about that, because when we throw things around like data-driven culture, well, it's nothing but a combination of behaviors driven by certain beliefs. And then if you want to change someone's behaviors, for example, to become more data-driven, well, the only way is to rewire their beliefs, which I'm sure we will spend some time on. But so this really captured your imagination, behavior, and then how can you look at data and work with data to understand behavior of the customer. So how did that lead you to your current mission, and what is your current mission?
I'll answer your first question.
Yes, please.
How did that lead me, right? I think that obsession, I say obsession, just with customer behavior, consumer behavior. My next role was in BI and marketing. It was with a small startup. Again, understanding, hey, not only how do people perform on your app or on your site, but also what are they consuming that led them to perform that, and connecting the media side with the app side, right? So super interesting to me. And for me, that just carried through my career, right? I did a stint in finance, FP&A there, and then for me, it was back into analytics, right? And I worked at analytics for about a decade at Google. And again, Google is all about user behavior, right? It's about what are people searching on, how are people searching on, what are people consuming, how are they consuming, right? What are the videos that they're using? And then leading me to today. Today at FanDuel, I had our data analytics organization, and that is comprised of analysts, data scientists, and data product, right? And so my mission here is to make sure that we are powering the business with insights, right? And transforming our data to be an enterprise data system. Right. FanDuel's a pretty young company, all in all. I mean, as an organization, it's about 9 years old, but functionally, all of the components of our company, all the different products in which we have, they are less than 5 years old, right? And so as you're thinking about it, it's pretty young when it comes from a data perspective. And so we're still in a big growth mode of how are we harnessing our data? How are we using our data? How are we facilitating it? So for me, creating that enterprise system as we grow, so we can scale as we grow as a company, is extremely important. And then on the analyst side is like, how do you transform that data, actually make it useful, right? Mm-hmm. How are you garnering insights? How are you giving our partners on the business side, on the marketing side, on the commercial side, on the fraud side? What insights are you giving them? Because that's the true magic for analytics to me, is what are you seeing as an analyst that people can't see on the surface?
Very interesting. So before we dive deeper into that, I mean, we did, I think now we're almost like 200 episodes, and we do interviews with some of the biggest companies that everyone knows. I did hear about FanDuel even before you and I started our conversation, but for those listeners who are not familiar, so how would you describe what is FanDuel? What do you guys stand for? Who do you serve? What kind of product services you offer?
Yeah, FanDuel, we are an online gaming company, and our products are, we started off as a fantasy company, a daily fantasy company. And that is the core roots and kind of the core backbone of what FanDuel was. Expanded into horse racing, so you can bet not only on fantasy sports, but also on horse racing. And then once legislation was overturned in the United States, where you can actually start betting on sports, right? Online betting on sports, again, and that is controlled at the state level, right? So we got into sports betting, and then also now online casino. We also have a free to play product for our users who don't actually want to put money out there. And then we also have a head-to-head kind of like a communal product called Face Off, which is quite interesting. Something that we're diving into. So a different products, but it's all centered around online gaming and entertainment.
Got it. I didn't even hear about the whole legislation being overturned. My last interaction with the U.S. Federal laws about gambling was when in high school I was making my pocket money from some poker. And I remember the heartbreak when my Full Tilt account was shut down, right? But then, okay, so now there are additional online services that are made available because of regulatory changes.
That's right. And there's certain states. Again, it goes down to the state. A state will dictate: can you bet on fantasy? Can you bet on horse racing? Can you bet on sports? And then can you bet online on a casino? And casino is the smallest footprint, actually, from an online perspective. It's only legal in 5 states, or we're in 5 states. Other municipalities in other states, right? They have that legislation where you might have to go into a brick and mortar, or they might have deals with different entities where that gambling can happen. So. Sports betting is the next, and daily fantasy sports is probably our largest net. We're in over 40 states. So the FanDuel as a whole, and what FanDuel is, and to your point, not everyone might know what FanDuel is right now, just because we're not in every single state.
Got it. Just a quick question around that, because we work with a lot of highly regulated industries. So some of the biggest pharmaceutical companies like Merck or Eli Lilly. Also financial firms, both from the financial services providers like Visa or MasterCard, but also some of the biggest banks. And I know that kind of regulation can make your life difficult if you're in data. Now, in this case, from a data perspective, is regulation something that's difficult for you guys to navigate, or actually it's not your biggest headache?
I wouldn't say that. I don't see regulation as being difficult. I think of regulation as being right for the user, right? And so when the regulators come in and say, how are you using data, right? And if they want to take a look at certain aspects of data, right? And you can start folding a number of different things into it. Your security, how secure is your data? How are you addressing privacy, right? How are you addressing ethics in your data, right? They're all fair questions. And the more you get from a regulator on constraints on what you can do, actually, the better it is for your user base, right? And so we welcome those conversations with our regulators to say, what are your thresholds for things that you are expecting from us, right? In some states, we might surpass some of their thresholds, and that's okay, because we'll have a minimum bar for ourselves for all of those different areas. Because for us, it's about the users. And one of the reasons that I joined FanDuel is, again, dedication to the user. We're here to enable people to enjoy our products, right? And give them really awesome products that they do end up enjoying, right? And but you have to take all of those data considerations into aspect, right? Where you're thinking about privacy, like I said, you're thinking about security, you're thinking about ethically, are we doing the right thing, right? And I'd say that we are, and we can unpack that if you would like. And I'd say that we are, and for me, those are the things that actually drive a healthy business. Again, a healthy obsession with your customers.
So I love that, and I love what you just said for multiple reasons. The main reason is because, and we've been saying this for a while, that regulations, we understand that it can cause a headache in a complex business. But the key is to stay on the offense instead of reacting and being defensive about this. Like, use it, like, look at it as an opportunity. And this is what comes through now that you're saying these things. That first of all, you're aware, you are absolutely confident in what you do because you focus on the user. And even what you're just saying now, right? Yes, we want to give an amazing, enjoyable experience to the users, but also they can have that experience and enjoy that in a secure environment, not worrying about being exposed or all that. So that's fantastic, because see, like, this is one of the ways that we've seen the more savvy data leaders really forging an advantage, which for a lot of people seems like an obstacle, right? So I really like that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, and a good example for us is in here, I'll just double click into ethics.
Yes.
A minute. Is it regulated? Do we have a regulation from any state that says ethically, how do you use certain data for your data models? Well, like there might be guidance, and I wouldn't say that it's like in stone ethically, like, oh, you have to do it like this. But we have a minimum threshold of how we use our data and our data models. And we have a ethical lens where, are we using certain PII data when we data model? No, we're not. Why? Because we don't think that's right for our customers. Right now, we are part of a larger organization based out of Europe, Flutter, right? And so there's a larger community of us that do discuss these things, and those businesses across the globe are a little bit older. But again, do you have to do it in the US at certain facets? Not always, right? But doesn't mean that we're going to lower our standards. Like, our standards will remain high. Why? Because it's the right thing for our users.
No, it's really cool. Plus, and this might be like a great segue into the organizational alignment, that also from our experience, when you do that work and you proactively pursue not just meeting regulations, but a lot of times exceeding that, and really being aware and crafting and then using a narrative around this that reassures your stakeholders, your users. But again, imagine how your CEO feels when he hears that, when he knows that, wow, okay, not only we're driving value from data and allows us to give a better experience to our customers, it helps our revenue, but also our backs are covered. That's great. Everyone feels happy, and you can really use that to bring people on board in data analytics, which might be then a good time for us to discuss some of that. So over the years, how did you find the challenges of the data leader evolve, especially when it comes to organizational transformation? And feel free to spend some time on what I'm getting from what you're saying now is that you're basically building this capability over at FanDuel. And
Yep.
I imagine that there are all kinds of hurdles and cool challenges to overcome. So what are some of those highlights?
Yeah. I want to start with, I actually think most people are data informed, right? And even data driven. I think most intelligent people that are going after their jobs are not always using some level of intuition or, what's worked for the last 10 years is this. Now, there's always that bringing that experience is always helpful to the business. But I do think most people will want to see data points to say what works better, A or B, right? And they'll make an informed decision on A or B using some information and some data. I think that the thing in the transformation that I've seen and some of the challenges that you see, I think in most organizations is, and it might depend on the maturity of that organization. If it's an organization that's extremely old, right, that maybe didn't use data in its infancy and maybe it's been around for 40, 50, 60 years, right, where it's been a lot of intuition, it's been a lot of market research, but not necessarily analytics that has driven some of the business decisions. Breaking that mold can actually be a lot harder than a younger company that is bred and kind of born in data, right? So we're a fairly young company. And from an organizational standpoint, we are. And everything that we have in data is a foundational element of what we do, right? We have a lot of data. We have a lot of our user data. We have a lot of data that from marketing to partnerships. We ingest a lot of data that we use internally here. And so I think it's a little bit easier in some of these younger companies. So I do want to kind of make that point that I do think people are data informed. One area that I think that is a gap, and I know people have on the shows probably said it before, like data literacy, the ability to read the data, the ability to interpret the data, the ability to actually understand what certain data points are delivering to you, right? And this is from an analytics perspective where you have to be very deliberate what you showcase, right? If you're doing an analysis and you're about to present it to somebody, a business partner, you want them to take some action, throwing a whole bunch of tables into slides and sharing a bunch of tables, which allows people to analyze in the moment, probably isn't the best approach. You want to be very specific with what you're doing. So I think the data literacy has always been, and continues, and will always continue to be, I think, an obstacle or a gap. I think that's probably one large area. And then I think another large area is what data can actually do for the company, right? And the expectations people have for certain analyses, and the expectations people have, especially on the data science side, with what can data science do for you? Again, it's data. Data science is math. It's models, right? You're modeling things out. Is it perfect? Well, no. It's not a crystal ball, right? They don't know for sure. Models don't know for sure. The probability might be there, but there's always this threshold of error that can come. Again, because it's only as good as the data that goes into it. And I think people believe that it's very simple, where you can just turn a key and say, oh, well, you're trained in this, create this model. When you create this model, you pump a whole bunch of data in, it's going to come out and it's going to tell us what we need to do for the next 3 months, or maybe the behavior of this customer group for the next 3 months. But there's so much more that goes into it than that. And I think that's a bit of the education about the complexity that it takes to evolve data. And I think that is something that, as a data leader, is part of my role to educate my partners on, to make sure that people understand what goes into the work in which we do, right? And to understand what it is that we can actually deliver versus what is expected that our teams deliver.
100%. And actually what you just said, that this is not a crystal ball. One of my main responsibilities is to educate the organization about what we can do. That in one of the podcasts with Sarah Bourgeois, she used to be the director of innovation and data analytics manager at Tormund Cat. I don't know if you saw that episode, but she's now with VoiceFlow. And she said she had this kind of catchphrase that we are teachers, not magicians. And I know that in our community, even in our master classes, this was something that they worked a lot with, like the groups of like, oh, wow, yeah, that's actually resonates. And there's a lot to unpack there. Speaking of education, you mentioned data literacy. So I think it's worth spending a little bit of time on that because it's a huge question now. A lot of people are trying to drive that data literacy, but a lot of times they don't even know with what kind of purpose. I like how you frame this, that you got to be intentional with everything that you do. As a data leader, you got to aim the right way. So with data literacy, what are you aiming at? Like, is it about making sure that every single person in the business knows how a data lake operates? Or do you have like a different goal? I'm trying not to lead the witness too much.
No. I actually have a different goal. I want to make sure that when you receive information and data, in however manner in which you want to receive it, right, that you know how to interpret that data that's most useful for you, right? So if I create, or my team creates a dashboard for a certain piece of the business, I want to walk them through the dashboard. What do the metrics actually mean, right? What can you extrapolate from these metrics? How do we want you to leverage the dashboard, right? And those are the types of things when it comes to data literacy about understanding how to use each component, right? And it could be very, you can be very consultative and say, if this metric goes up, if this metric goes down, then maybe you have a rubric that says, here's what you want to do, or here's the 3 things you want to look into, right? And giving people a playbook of understanding, and like I said, where trajectory changes, it could change your business decision. Now, without giving people that insight, without giving people kind of that that training and that, then it's their interpretation. Now, I've seen this happen a lot throughout my career where data's been misinterpreted. Oh, this went up and this other metric went up. It's probably one's driving the other, so this is the decision we have to make. Well, not necessarily, right? That's an actual analysis that we should do for you, right? So you can't always get an analysis right from a dashboard. You can see trends, you can see change, you can report on your KPIs, but what we should do is come back and say, hey, can you drill into this to make sure I really understand the drivers of it, right? And that's another part of the data literacy. What can you take away from something versus what can't you take away from something? To go back from, hey, how does a data lake work, right? How do we, what's unstructured versus structured data? If people want to know, I'm happy to give them that education. I don't necessarily think people really want to know, right? I think that's what data product and data engineers and data analysts, I think that's what we do on the back end that makes the data more readily available and easier for people to use, right? It's like going into marketing, right? If somebody says, hey, we're going to give this promotion to this user group, I don't double click into that. I trust that they know what they're doing. I trust that they have something in the back end that says, we know that this promotion is going to work for this user group, or maybe we're testing something, right? But I'm not going to double click into that. Again, that's their expertise. And I think the data lake, the data infrastructure, how you process the data, how you accumulate the data, how you transform the data, you want to give visibility into it, but that's not one of it. By literacy, again, happy to educate, not necessary to educate.
And I know that people, when we talk about the subject, there's a lot of like semantics, which I think can be actually meaningful. So let me give you an example. A lot of people like to say that, hey, let's not use data literacy. Let's maybe frame it as data fluency. It's a friendlier way of engaging the business. They don't want to feel illiterate. And then I read it somewhere, and I would like to hear your take on that. So I don't know what page, but it said that, look, actually, don't try to achieve data literacy in the business. Aim at the data fluency and analytics literacy. Now, I would like to ask you, as a senior professional, is that a meaningful statement? Is that a meaningful distinction? What is your take on that? Like playing with words here, because it's actually quite important when we talk about education, right?
Yeah, and I actually think that that's fair. I think that you can probably, I think you could, in certain instances, right, you could use fluency or you could use literacy, right? And I think the semantics there are a bit smaller, right? But to your point, where if you want people to be fluent in something, which again is interpretation of data, I think that is I think it's a fair push, right? I think it's fair to say that it's a way of how do you interpret something, right? Like you can be fluent in a language and maybe not be literate in the language, and I think maybe that's the conduit that you can use, right? Like you might not be able to read and write it, but maybe you can speak it, right? And again, that gets you enough where maybe you can go visit someplace and be there for a while without any struggles. So I think that's a very, very fair semantics push, where I'd say, rolling it back, I'd probably say my goal would be data fluency then, because I want people to be fluent in data. I want people to be able to interpret it and to know how to use it. The literacy part, I think it's fair to say, do you know how it's actually constructed, right? Again, I'll go back to my probably bad analogy of language. Like if you're speaking Spanish, do you know every which way to use a comma? Well, not necessarily. And maybe you do. Maybe you want to, if you want to understand the back end of the data. That is, to me, like, what's the grammar that actually goes into the sentence versus just being able to speak it, which is the fluency part.
The understanding of the anatomy, right? That's like a different level of competence. Okay, really cool. So what is your approach to instilling that data fluency, analytics literacy in the organization? Do you believe in like a targeted campaign? Is it something that maybe you do on the fly, as and when it's needed? What is your philosophy on this?
I believe that's the responsibility of the analysts, the data scientists, and the data organization as a whole. I believe it's our responsibility to train the data organization to understand how to help people interpret the data. I believe that it's our responsibility to make sure that the analysts understand, how do you visualize data? Data visualization is a passion of mine, right? Because in my way, there's an optimal way that you can relay information. Again, I'll go back to, Leslie, what I said earlier. If you're giving a presentation and 3 of your slides are just screenshots of spreadsheets, probably not optimal, right? Because there's probably 1 or 2 data points in those spreadsheets you actually want people to focus on, but now you're not letting them focus on those data points. So it is the responsibility of individuals, and for me and my team, right, on how do you relay that information. It could be through a visualization, it could be through a presentation, it could just be through an email, right? But how do you help your users understand the work in which you do, right? So because I have a phrase that I love to use. I never point the finger, I point the thumb. What can we do different? What can we do to help people be fluent here, right? Point the thumb. And for me, and that's why I say it's our responsibility, because if I'm going to give you a piece of information, Laszlo, it's not your responsibility to learn how to read it. It's mine to teach you. So I think we bear that. I keep saying we bear that burden, and I say burden in just the best context, right? We bear that on our organization because it should be us who's walking out and teaching individuals, right? Now, that might permeate culturally through, right? You might teach someone in, again, I'll use marketing. You might teach somebody in marketing, and maybe they teach somebody else, and and then all of a sudden 1 year later, everybody's very fluent, and that's great. That's organically grown. But you want to make sure 1 year later, if somebody's new to the team, again, you're giving them that context. Hey, let me show you how I want you to use this information.
Okay, so this kind of brings us to the question of storytelling, because when you're trying to convince someone or get them to see like why something is useful for them, you're placing them within a certain narrative. Your life is your life is like this right now. Your world is like this right now, and it can be something different. So the contextual narrative, right, is there. So you cannot really avoid telling stories. So I have multiple questions around this, especially because you also brought up visualization. But in general, if we just take a step back, how do you see the role of storytelling in your data leadership career? How do you approach storytelling? What do you think is the importance and the role of that in your craft and profession?
So I think storytelling is not only from a leadership perspective, it's not something that I myself hold myself accountable for that, and my leadership team, but also every analyst in the org, every data scientist, like, you have to tell a story. If you're going to go and present something, the question, unless it's a collaborative, hey, I want to get your eyes on this because I want to collaborate and get your take on this, you should have a story and have an opinion, right? And I think about it from, I'm going to bring it back. I'm an analyst by trade, right? As an equation, right? We did X, it's going to deliver Y, and the impact is going to be Z, right? Right. And now you can unpack each one of those, but I'm trying to simplify it for us, where storytelling, I think, is probably one of the biggest attributes for an analyst. And if you ask me what the number one attribute for any analyst is, curiosity. It is it's 100% for me, curiosity. But you have to be able to then, once you do really great work, you could be curious, you could be the best analyst, you could have the best models, but if you can't relay that in a way that's impactful, again, X did Y and it's going to yield you Z, then your work is going to have lower impact than what you'd ever imagine. And I think I think you're bringing up, and again, we're on the data storytellers, but you really, really bring up a really great point where people have to have that understanding, and they have to get that training. It's not always intuitive, right? When you walk into an organization and you look at some of the work that people have done, it's not in that format, right? But once you build that muscle, once you hone that muscle over time, then you can start looking at everyone's work and go, oh, wow, there's some consistencies in this work. It's not all the same work, but the structure is the same. Simplicity, it's short, it's to the point, and it's meaningful, right? And I think the storytelling aspect is it's critical, and it's probably one of the biggest gaps in analytics, right? Because as an analyst, you walk in, and I think a lot of people will say, well, hey, if you're to stand up a learning and development program for your analysts, the first thing you're going to do is technical. Do you know how to code and write scripts and do all these technical things, right? And then how many of those learning and development programs are actually, hey, here's a storytelling, here's a data visualization course, but it's critically important.
And you pointed it out, and absolutely, we are 100% on the same page with that. In fact, I think this is what our whole company is built on. In fact, you guys built it. Like you the senior data analytics practitioners, you were the ones who pointed this out, and we're just kind of the war journalists capturing how this actually shakes out, because what you said that's the biggest gap, storytelling. Well, why though? So we just had a great conversation with Dave Coughlin, just released the podcast. He wrote a book called Entry Level Escape. It's mainly for people who want to make good cases for promotions, right? Actually, whether you're a junior person or a senior, I think it's an incredibly useful book. How to get the most out of your team, but also just in general, like how to look at your professional value. And he lays out this very simple framework of, you have your core competence, right? So that's your domain knowledge. In your case, it's data analytics, data science, right? Of course, it can fluctuate between professionals, but usually that's the thing that's demanded. That's just a given, right? Of course, if there are some specific needs, you can double down on certain things, but that's what everyone is doing. No one will differentiate themselves by, excelling data science capabilities. Now, what we arrive at, and most people realize, is that it's not enough. You also have to have the business savvy, the business understanding. And, that's a gap. Like, a lot of data scientists don't really understand the business, don't really think the business. And this is where I would say that if you guys have a core competence that's an expert level, right? The business knowledge, and, someone like you, like evidently, like, extremely seasoned already in this, but then I would say that in general, that would be like an intermediate level skill. And what we think is missing, which is most often is just a beginner level skill, is the storytelling, which I would say that if we have data science as a core competence and then business savvy as a business understanding, this is more like influence psychology. That's what it is. And it's practical applications, right? So yeah, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, I totally agree with you. And it goes back into, how do you train? What is a trainable thing? Or, I mean, you can go back to hiring practices. Like, what do you hire on? Because whenever I think about hiring, I think about, what are the things that I need for this person to know to get this role, right? And what are the things that are teachable to that person, right? And a lot of the times, and again, I mean, a lot of people gone through university courses, right? I mean, I've never taken a storytelling course in university, even though it probably should be in the business courses, right? To say, how do you actually get to influence individuals, especially as an analyst, right? You are taking information, or data science, you're taking a bunch of information and you're drawing an insight. And an insight is different than something surface level. I'm not saying like, your number went from 1 to 2, it's plus 100%. Well, yeah, anyone can see that. The question is why. Okay. So if I figure out the why that went up, the why then should say, well, maybe we should do something different, or it'll reinforce we should continue to do something. Either way, Laszlo, it's a story. Right. And I think to your point where, what are stepping back, what are the fundamentals of any role, right? You have to understand core competencies to do your job, right? A data scientist needs to know how to code. They need to know how to build models, right? Second thing is business context. A lot of times, unless you're born and bred and continue in the same industry, you learn that over time. I'll raise my hand. I had to learn I had to learn the sports betting industry, the casino industry, the fantasy industry. I had to learn that when I got here. And that takes some time. And a lot of times you learn that on the job, right? You learn that by ingraining yourself, by using the products, by talking to people, by understanding reviews and what people are interested in, what's important to the business, and why do we have our strategy. And I think you just get a lot of that. Until your last point is, unless you're mechanically just doing a role, you're always going to have some level of influence. And going back to data, how do you influence individuals? And you have to understand the story, right? You have to, in any presentation, and this is just like tactical, right? I always zoom out where I can see all the boxes of my presentation. First off, if I have to keep scrolling, it's probably too long. Okay. Secondly, I walk through and I go, what's my story on each slide? Simply, just like, what am I trying to get over to the person, right? And these are the types of things that people need to be trained on. These are the types of things that people need to understand, because you could have the best model in the world, right? You can say, I can predict with 100% certainty how all of your users are going to behave and how to maximize your revenue and your profits from your business. But if that just sits on the shelf because nobody understands it and you couldn't articulate it to people, it's actually useless. It's actually not the best model, right? Because it yields you nothing. And so going back, it's a fundamental, I think, gap when a lot of people enter an analytic role. Listen, let's talk personally. Myself, as an analyst growing up, I had to learn that, right? I took courses on it. I took side courses on. I actually took storytelling course. At one of my companies, I took 2 storytelling courses within a matter of 3 weeks. Why? Because I wasn't getting the influence I wanted. I didn't understand. I'm like, guys, the data's right here. It's telling you the right thing. Why? So I couldn't tell the story. And I had to train myself on that, right? And I make sure that my team understands now the importance of it, the importance of a narrative, the importance of go in, simplify things. Again, I'll always use that like simple equation. Like, hey, here's the problem. I did X and it yielded Y, and Z is that impact. Again, it goes, we're analysts and equations make sense to us. And so it's like having that framework but enabling the people in your organization to make sure that they understand the importance of it. I think that's probably what you were getting at. What is the importance of it? Extremely important, right? As a fundamental building block, again, do you know how to do the job? Yes. Great. Do you have business contacts? You will. If you don't today, you will. And I'm going to make sure I enable you to do that. And can you tell the story? Right? And if you can't, it's my job to make sure that you can. And if I don't do that, I'm actually doing a disservice to the company.
And also your team, and also for your own professional development as well. Actually, because this is so cool. I'm just writing an article. I think I will publish it next week. It's just a lot of these conversations distilled. And the title is Data Analytics, Decision Science, and Influence Psychology. So exactly what you just said, because your capability to build the thing is your data analytics skill. And then the business context is actually, if people look up decision science, that is about understanding the business context so that you know that directionally how you should go about informing decisions that are applicable in the business. It's not just in the vacuum of the data technology or the data service, but it actually has this business coherence. And then actually influence psychology, which is, storytelling falls under that. It's like a vehicle of that is what will move things forward, is what will drive things forward, is what will actually make people invest themselves into whatever you're offering. It is based on which they take action, right?
Right. And people get training on influence at all levels of the organization, right? You train on how do you influence up? How do you influence without being part of someone's team? And there's a lot of consultancies that have been very successful training individuals like this, right? And it's part of executive training.
Mm-hmm.
How do you influence, right? And by not letting that matriculate down through the entire organization, again, to your point, I think the article, I can't wait to read the article, because it is definitely a component that I don't know if people realize the importance. Right. But as we talk about it, you say, well, of course it is. Of course it is. Right. But I don't think people always in our community, in the data community, I don't think they realize that. And I think that there has to be some level of like proliferation there about, okay, how do you take this idea and how do you get it to the masses? How do you bake this in? Right. It can be organization by organization. The hope is if I'm talking to you in 10 years, like, storytelling is just a part of the analyst team.
Exactly. It's part and parcel. It becomes an integral part, just like how, because I'm working for data analytics, to be an integral part of how business is done. And that's our goal, so that storytelling will be an embedded part of the craft, of the profession, right? I want to be made obsolete. That's my goal. That's my goal. So that's really cool, especially because now as we think about it in an intentional way, then we see that huge gap, because people, as you said, don't realize the importance. And what you said, when you try to influence someone, they gotta understand the importance of that. The stakes are high, and the stakes are really is that this influence psychology bit is truly the most accessible, easiest to adopt force multiplier that you can have in your toolkit as a data analytics practitioner.
Yep.
Full stop, right?
And here, I'm going to give you another spin on it too.
Mm-hmm.
Because everything I talked about, that equation I was talking about, X, Y, and Z, the notion there is you've done something that showed something positive and a positive output. But I don't always want everyone to show a positive output. I actually want you to show, I want people to be able to show failures. Okay, and let me tell you what I mean by that. I think failing is an essential part of growth, right? I think failing is an essential part of innovation. Because if you're not failing, that means you're not thinking outside of your bounds. If you're not thinking outside of your bounds, then you're not innovating as much as you possibly could. Right. So I want people to try things. And I try to instill this in every, in my organization, where we try to instill, it's okay to fail. Okay. And I'll give this, we get our org, we do these town halls or these all hands every few months. And we give an award on the best piece of work and the best failure, or the biggest failure. If you have enough courage to think outside of the box, and you have enough courage to then showcase that you didn't do that something that you didn't work out as what you thought it would do. Like, I want to reward that. And we do. And we reward that. Now, going back to storytelling, there's a story in that failure. Okay? There's a story in me saying, hey, I did this analysis that no one's done before. Or I've created this model that no one's ever created before. And like any analyst, you have some hypothesis and you're going to try to work that. And it's okay to have a story and for me to say, hey, Laszlo, I did this analysis for you and your team. And I'm going to tell you, here's what we did and here's what the output was. And the output was like a net zero. So I'm going to tell you what not to do. I'm going to show again, but this is part of the storytelling there. And it enables you to not only talk about all of your wins and all the great pieces of work, but also all the failures in what you've done, because everything's a learning. And the storytelling piece is about talking about what you learned. Again, we can always, most people are in business, right? But we have to have some level of impact. But it's about learning throughout the process that will then yield you impact at some point. So I think that storytelling angle is extremely important for that aspect as well, right? You're allowing analysts to do what I think is the most important thing, which is be curious. Going back to being curious. When you're curious, you're going to do a really good job and you're going to yield something awesome. And there's going to be lots of times in which you fail. And every single one of those should be relayed back to your stakeholders, being relayed back to your team in a story format so we can learn, A, what doesn't work and what not to do anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is like, well, it was so well put, because this is the polar opposite of what we could label as the arrogance of the intellect, right? Because curiosity is by virtue is a posture of humility, because I want to know, right? Like I'm open. I want to know. And basically that learning process, which is enabled by the curiosity, driven by fundamentally humility, will yield you those learning experiences. And people actually love when they see that. People love to hear about your learning process. And this is how they actually trust you more. So it's one of those counterintuitive things, man. You being curious, you admitting that, look, I don't know everything, I'm happy to fail, is what will make people trust you more, invest in you more, and take on your input more, because ultimately that's what you want to be, right? Trusted business advisors.
Yeah. And I love that. I love business advisors. We try to lean into that as much as humanly possible. But it also, again, it goes into an insight. A failure is an insight too, right? And for me, an analyst isn't someone who can just do reporting. Like there's BI functions, right? That's reporting function. True analyst is someone who brings insights, someone who can extrapolate information, someone who can dive in. They figure out the why underneath the why and underneath the why. They can say, hey, if you pull this lever today and X number of days, this thing's going to move for you. Because we've done that work, we've done that insight. But again, going back to failure, that's also an insight. If I pull this lever today and X number of days, nothing will change. So don't pull this lever. Right. And I use that as like a metaphor of like some business change in what you want to do. Right. That's still an insight, which then goes back to that still requires a level of understanding. How do you tell that story? Right. Without feeling vulnerable, without feeling exposed, like, oh no, I did this piece of work and it's not yielding anything. No, it's yielding an insight. Right. And I think those are the healthy conversations, and those are the healthy teachings that you have to give to any analyst or data organization to make sure that they understand that from a fundamental principle, that is part of the job. Right. And it also shows them you're not wasting any time. You're not wasting any effort or any energy. Right. Because if I spent 2 weeks doing something and all of a sudden, again, didn't work, I still did my job. So let me tell you about it.
Oh, fantastic. And look, I have so many more questions around this. We just came up against the hour. So I think I only have time to ask you one more question, and I'm sure we'll find some ways to collaborate, hopefully, when you can dive into some of the nuances of your experiences and insights, and we can showcase that for our community. But what are you most excited about today in data analytics? With all the buzz going around, ChatGPT, generative language modeling, every executive is excited about analytics. Obviously, there are these challenges when the real adoption a lot of times is lagging. But if you wanted to zoom in on the greatest source of your excitement right now about data analytics, what would that be?
For me, the most exciting thing right now is explore, and it's about like, what are the problems and the solutions that we have, right? And I think back in the day, legacy-wise, people say, what's the biggest obstacle right now, or what, right? It's like in data, it's technology. Like that technology wasn't there to get everything that you needed, to process the data, to visualize it, to get that data, to do the insight. Like the technology's caught up. We have the technology and everything that we want to do. What actually excites me is how are we leaning into that technology even more, right? And here, I'll just anchor on that thing, like ChatGPT. Everyone's excited about it. I love it, right? I actually think it's fantastic. Some people might say, oh, well, you're going to tell it how to write a query. Isn't that what analysts do? Absolutely, that's what analysts do. And I want to harness it, right? Because I always think about how are we driving efficiencies in everything in which we do, right? I want to take those smaller steps and say, what takes up your time every day? Because the most important thing anyone can do at a job is sit there and think. Okay? When you think, now you're trying to solve a problem. You're coming up with a solution, right? You're building a framework. You're trying to understand something, right? And what's exciting to me is, how do you take those new pieces of AI, right? How do you take those things and how do you build them into your systems? How do you build them into your company, right? Are you going to take away an analyst because you're implementing some ChatGPT internally? No. You're going to make coding more efficient, scripting more efficient, right? And you're going to make answering questions quicker and faster for your stakeholders, right? And again, so I think like leaning into, now that technology is caught up, it's almost now blowing past us a bit. So it's like grabbing onto that and then figuring out with all of that new tech that's with any new tech coming out, right? Especially AI, generative tech, right? Visual generative tech also, like all of these things, it's like you can go on and you can create ads, or you can create images that you could potentially use as ads, right? And just AI generated thing quickly. You don't do you have to do production? No. Now, does that mean production companies go out of business? Absolutely not. What they can think about is what's the next frontier in production. So I think about it from an analyst perspective. They can do more analysis. They can do it quicker. They can do it faster. They can do it more efficient. They can do tests that they've never had time to do before. Why? Because they're answering questions and writing scripts. So that's like super exciting to me, of how do you harness everything that's out there today and move yourself forward magnitudes forward versus what you could possibly do with just sheer effort today.
Well, amen, because that's exactly how I think about it. So whenever I read like, oh, bye Photoshop artists, bye analysts, and just showcasing some shit, I'm like, no, you're missing the point. The whole idea is that now people who are dedicated to that craft and really good at what they do, now it just kind of their horizons are broadened in terms of what they can achieve leveraging these things. So the quality of each of those domains and then what you can produce in them, now that's the ceiling that is being removed by these. Of course, I understand, it's growing super fast. I understand that, it can be a little bit of vertigo when these things hit, but I think a lot of people are missing the mark.
Yeah, if you're not leaning into them and trying to harness them again, and I think I love it how you said ceiling, because it just reminds me, it raises your floor. It raises your minimum capabilities, right? And again, what's the best thing for any human being to do? For me, for an analyst, I want you to sit there and think about a solution. Think about the different ways you can solve it. Maybe if I give you an extra hour a day, you're going to come up with something that we didn't even think about before. Why? Because you had that extra hour. Why? Because you're harnessing tech, right? And that's exciting.
Absolutely. And I've also found myself actually, even in the business, first of all, a lot of jobs in our company were basically filled in by generative AI, but they created 2 jobs for every job they filled in, right? So that's one. And the other thing is that the areas that generative language modeling helps the most, ironically, when you meaningfully engage with it, you end up spending more time with it than before, and the quality is just vastly increased. So it's one of those things. So, Dejan, I don't want to run more of your time. I understand we already went over. So this was really fun. And thank you for your time. Thank you for the insights. And, I'm sure that this wasn't the end of the road. And we'll find some ways to collaborate moving forward.
Well, my pleasure, and a lot of gratitude to you and Data Storytellers, because it's a wonderful forum, and I'm humbled by the opportunity. So thank you.
Our pleasure.